Disc 2.
Chapter 4. "You must come and see the clues and things for the murder hunt, Monsieur Poirot," said Mrs. Oliver breathlessly. Poirot rose and followed them obediently. The three of them went across the hall and into a small room furnished plainly as a business office.
"Lethal weapons to your left,"
observed Captain Warburton, waving his hand towards a small baize-covered card table. On it were laid out a small pistol, a piece of lead piping with a rusty, sinister stain on it, a blue bottle labelled poison, a length of clothesline, and a hypodermic syringe. "Those are the weapons," explained Mrs. Oliver, "and these are the suspects." She handed him a printed card, which he read with interest. Suspects. Estelle Glynn, a beautiful and mysterious young woman, the guest of Colonel Blunt, the local squire whose daughter, Joan, is married to Peter Gay, a young atom scientist. Miss Willing, a housekeeper. Quiet, a butler. Maya Stavisky, a girl hiker. Esteban Loyola, an uninvited guest. Poirot blinked and looked towards Mrs. Oliver in mute incomprehension. "What a magnificent cast of characters," he said politely. "But permit me to ask, madame, what does the competitor do?"
"Turn the card over,"
said Captain Warburton. Poirot did so. On the other side was printed name and address, solution, name of murderer, weapon, motive, time and place, reasons for arriving at your conclusions.
"Now, everyone who enters gets one of these," explained Captain Warburton rapidly. "Also a notebook and pencil for copying clues. There'll be 6 clues. You go on from one to the other like a treasure hunt, and the weapons are concealed in suspicious places. Now, here's the first clue, a snapshot. Everyone starts with one of these."
Poirot took the small print from him and studied it with a frown. Then he turned it upside down. He still looked puzzled. Warburton laughed.
"Ingenious bit of trick photography, isn't it?"
He said complacently,
"It's quite simple once you know what it is."
Poirot, who did not know what it was, felt a mounting annoyance.
"Some kind of barred window?"
he suggested.
"Looks a bit like it, I admit. No, it's a section of a tennis net."
"Ah." Poirot looked again at the snapshot.
"Yes, it is as you say. It's quite obvious when you have been told what it is. Yes, well, so much depends on how you look at a thing,"
laughed Warburton.
"That is a very profound truth. But the second clue will be found in a box under the centre of the tennis net. In the box are this empty poison bottle here and a loose cork."
"Only, you see," said Mrs. Oliver rapidly, "it's a screw-topped bottle, so the cork is really the clue."
"Oh, I know, madame, that you are always full of ingenuity, but I do not quite see—"
Mrs. Oliver interrupted him. "Oh, but of course," she said, "there's a story. Like in a magazine serial, a synopsis." She turned to Captain Warburton. "Have you got the leaflets?"
"No, they've not come from the printers yet."
"Oh, but they promised."
I know. Everyone always promises. They'll be ready this evening at 6. I'm going in to fetch them in the car."
"Oh, good." Mrs. Oliver gave a deep sigh and turned to Poirot. "Well, I'll have to tell it you then. Only I'm not very good at telling things. I mean, if I write things, I get them perfectly clear. But if I talk, it always sounds the most frightful muddle, and that's why I never discuss my plots with anyone. I've learned not to, because if I do, they just look at me blankly and say, yes, but I don't see what happened, and surely that can't possibly make a book. It's so damping, and not true, because when I write it, it does." Mrs. Oliver paused for breath, and then went on. "Well, it's like this. There's Peter Gay, who's a young atom scientist, and he's suspected suspected of being in the pay of the communists, and he's married to this girl, Joan Blunt, and his first wife's dead. But she isn't, and she turns up because she's a secret agent, or perhaps not. I mean, she may really be a hiker, and the wife's having an affair, and this man Loyola turns up either to meet Maya or to spy upon her, and there's a blackmailing letter which might be from the housekeeper, or again it might be the butler, and the revolver's missing, and as you don't know who the blackmailing letter's to, and the hypodermic syringe fell out at dinner, and after that it disappeared. Mrs. Oliver came to a full stop, estimating correctly Poirot's reaction. "Yes, I know," she said sympathetically. "It sounds just a muddle, but it isn't really. Well, not in my head. And when you see the synopsis leaflet, you'll find it's quite clear. And anyway," she ended, "the story doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, well, not to you. All you've got to do is to present the prizes, and very nice prizes. The first's a silver cigarette case shaped like a revolver. And you say how remarkably clever the solver has been." Poirot thought to himself that the solver would indeed have been clever. In fact, he doubted very much that there would be a solver. The whole plot and action of the murder hunt seemed to him to be wrapped in impenetrable fog. "Well," said Captain Warburton cheerfully, glancing at his wristwatch, "I'd better be off to the printers and collect." Mrs. Oliver groaned. "If they're not done—" "Oh, they're done all right. I telephoned. So long." He left the room. Mrs. Oliver immediately clutched Poirot by the arm and demanded in a hoarse whisper, "Well?" "Well, what? Have you found out anything, or spotted anybody?" Poirot replied with mild reproof in his tones. "Everybody and everything seems to me completely normal." "Normal? Well, perhaps that is not quite the right word. Lady Stubbs, as you say, is definitely subnormal, and Mr. Legg would appear to be rather abnormal." "Oh, he's all right," said Mrs. Oliver impatiently. "He's had a nervous breakdown." Poirot did not question the somewhat doubtful wording of this sentence, but accepted it at its face value. "Everybody appears to be in the expected state of nervous agitation, high excitement, general fatigue, and strong irritation, which are characteristics of preparations for this form of entertainment. If you could only indicate—" "Shh!" Mrs. Oliver grasped his arm again. "Someone's coming." It was just like a bad melodrama, Poirot felt, his own irritation mounting. The pleasant, mild face of Miss Brewis appeared round the door. "Oh, there you are, Monsieur Poirot. I've been looking for you to show you your room." She led him up the staircase and along a passage to a big, airy room looking out over the river. "There is a bathroom just opposite. Sir George talks of adding more bathrooms, but to do so would sadly impair the proportions of the rooms. I hope you'll find everything quite comfortable." "Oh, yes, indeed." Poirot swept an appreciative eye over the small bookstand, the reading lamp, and the box labelled biscuits by the bedside. "You seem in this house to have everything organized to perfection. Am I to congratulate you or my charming hostess?" "Lady Stubbs's time is fully taken up in being charming," said Miss Brewis, a slightly acid note in her voice. "A very decorative young woman," mused Poirot. "As you say. But in other respects, is she not, perhaps—" He broke off. "Oh, pardon, I am indiscreet. I comment on something I ought not perhaps to mention." Miss Brewis gave him a steady look. She said dryly, "Lady Stubbs knows perfectly well exactly what she is doing. Besides being, as you said, a very decorative young woman, she is also a very shrewd one." She had turned away and left the room before Poirot's eyebrows had fully risen in surprise. So that was what the efficient Miss Brewis thought, was it? Or had she merely said so for some reason of her own? And why had she made such a statement to him, to a newcomer? Because he was a newcomer, perhaps? And also because he was a foreigner. As Hercule Poirot had discovered by experience, there were many English people who considered that what one said to foreigners didn't count. He frowned perplexedly, staring absent-mindedly at the door out of which Miss Brewis had gone. Then he strolled over to the window and stood looking out. As he did so, he saw Lady Stubbs come out of the house with Mrs. Folliot, and they stood for a moment or two talking by the big magnolia tree. Then Mrs. Folliot nodded a goodbye, picked up her gardening basket and gloves, and trotted off down the drive. Lady Stubbs stood watching her for a moment, then absent-mindedly pulled off a magnolia flower, smelt it, and began slowly to walk down the path that led through the trees to the river. She looked just once over her shoulder before she disappeared from sight. From behind the magnolia tree, Michael Wayman came quietly into view, paused a moment irresolutely, and then followed the tall, slim figure down into the trees. A good-looking and dynamic young man, Poirot thought, with a more attractive personality, no doubt, than that of Sir George Stubbs. But if so, what of it? Such patterns formed themselves eternally through life. Rich, middle-aged, unattractive husband, young and beautiful wife with or without sufficient mental development, attractive and susceptible young man. What was there in that to make Mrs. Oliver utter a peremptory summons through the telephone? Mrs. Oliver no doubt had a vivid imagination, but after all, murmured Hercule Poirot to himself, I am not a consultant in adultery, or an incipient adultery. Could there really be anything in this extraordinary notion of Mrs. Oliver's that something was wrong? Mrs. Oliver was a singularly muddle-headed woman, and how she managed somehow or other to turn out coherent detective stories was beyond him. And yet, for all her muddle-headedness, she often surprised him by her sudden perception of truth. The time is short, he murmured to himself. Now, is there something wrong here, as Mrs. Oliver believes? I am inclined to think there is. But what? Who is there who could enlighten me? I need to know more, much more, about the people in the house. Who is there who could inform me? After a moment's reflection, he seized his hat. Poirot never risked going out in the evening air with uncovered head, and hurried out of his room and down the stairs. He heard afar the dictatorial baying of Mrs. Masterton's deep voice. Nearer at hand, Sir George's voice rose with an amorous intonation. Damn becoming, that yashmak thing. Wish I had you in my harem, Sally. I shall come and have my fortune told a good deal tomorrow. What'll you tell me, eh? There was a slight scuffle, and Sally Legg's voice said breathlessly, George, you mustn't. Poirot raised his eyebrows and slipped out of a conveniently adjacent side door. He set off at top speed down a back drive, which his sense of locality enabled him to predict would at some point join the front drive. His manoeuvre was successful and enabled him, panting very slightly, to come up beside Mrs. Folliot and relieve her in a gallant manner of her gardening basket. You permit me, madame? Oh, thank you, Monsieur Poirot. That's very kind of you. But it's not heavy. No, allow me to carry it for you to your home. You live near here? Well, I actually live in the lodge by the front gate. Sir George very kindly rents it to me. The lodge by the front gate of her former home. How did she really feel about that, Poirot wondered. Her composure was so absolute that he had no clue to her feelings. He changed the subject by observing, Lady Stubbs is much younger than her husband, is she not? 23 years younger. Oh, but physically she is very attractive. Mrs. Folliot said quietly, Hattie is a dear, good child. It was not an answer he had expected. Mrs. Folliot went on, I know her very well, you see. For a short time she was under my care. Oh, I did not know that. Well, how should you? It is in a way a sad story. Her people had estates, sugar estates, in the West Indies. As a result of an earthquake, the house there was burned down, and her parents and brothers and sisters all lost their lives. Hattie herself was at a convent in Paris, and was thus suddenly left without any near relatives. It was considered advisable by the executors that Hattie should be chaperoned and introduced into society after she had spent a certain time abroad, and I accepted the charge of her. Mrs. Folliot added with a dry smile, I can smarten myself up on occasions, and, well, naturally I had the necessary connections. In fact, the late governor had been a close friend of ours. Oh, naturally, madame, I understand all that. Well, no, it suited me very well. I was going through a difficult time. My husband had died just before the outbreak of war. My elder son, who was in the Navy, went down with his ship. My younger son, who had been out in Kenya, came back, joined the commandos, and was killed in Italy. And that meant 3 lots of death duties, and this house had to be put up for sale. I myself was very badly off, and I was glad of the distraction of having someone young to look after and travel about with. I became very fond of Hattie, all the more so, perhaps, because I soon realized that she was, shall we say, not fully capable of fending for herself. Understand me, Monsieur Poirot, Hattie is not mentally deficient, but she is what country folk describe as simple. She is easily imposed upon, over-docile, completely open to suggestion. I think myself that it was a blessing that there was practically no money. If she had been an heiress, her position might have been one of much greater difficulty. She was attractive to men, and, being of an affectionate nature, was easily attracted and influenced. She had definitely to be looked after. When, after the final winding up of her parents' estate, it was discovered that the plantation was destroyed, and there were more debts than assets, I could only be thankful that a man such as Sir George Stubbs had fallen in love with her and wanted to marry her.
Possibly, yes, it was a solution.
Now, Sir George, said Mrs. Folliot, though he is a self-made man and, let us face it, a complete vulgarian, is kindly and fundamentally decent, besides being extremely wealthy. I don't think he would ever ask for mental companionship from a wife, which is just as well. Hattie is everything he wants. She displays clothes and jewels to perfection, is affectionate and willing, and is completely happy with him. Now, I confess that I'm very thankful that that is so, for I admit that I deliberately influenced her to accept him. If it had turned out badly, well, her voice faltered a little, it would have been my fault for urging her to marry a man so many years older than herself. You see, as I told you, Hattie is completely suggestible. Anyone she is with at the time can dominate her.
It seems to me, said Poirot approvingly, that you made their most prudent arrangement for her. I am not, like the English, romantic. To arrange a good marriage, one must take more than romance into consideration. He added, and as for this place here, Nasse House, it is a most beautiful spot. Quite, as the saying goes, out of this world.
Yes, well, since Nasse had to be sold, said Mrs. Folliot, with a faint tremor in her voice, I am glad that Sir George bought it. It was requisitioned during the war by the army, and afterwards it might have been bought and made into a guest house or school, the rooms cut up and partitioned, distorted out of their natural beauty. Our neighbours, the Fletchers at Houdoun, had to sell their place, and it's now a youth hostel. One is glad that young people should enjoy themselves, and fortunately Houdoun is late Victorian and of no great architectural merit, so that the alterations do not matter. But I'm afraid some of the young people trespass on our grounds. It makes Sir George very angry. It's true that they have occasionally damaged the rare shrubs by hacking them about. They come through here, trying to get a shortcut to the ferry across the river. They were standing now by the front gate. The lodge, a small, white, one-storied building, lay a little back from the drive with a small railed garden round it. Mrs. Folliot took back her basket from Poirot with a word of thanks. I was always very fond of the lodge, she said, looking at it affectionately. Myrtle, our head gardener for 30 years, used to live there. I much prefer it to the top cottage, though it has been enlarged and modernized by Sir George. But it had to be. We've quite a young man now as head gardener, with a young wife, and these young women must have electric irons and modern cookers and television and all that. One must go with the times, she sighed. No, there's hardly a person left now on the estate from the old days. All new faces.
I am glad, madame, said Poirot, that you at least have found a haven.
You know those lines of Spencer's? Sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, ease after war, death after life, doth greatly please. She paused, and said without any change of tone, It's a very wicked world, Monsieur Poirot, and there are very wicked people in the world. You probably know that as well as I do. I don't say so before the younger people. It might discourage them, but it's true. Yes, it's a very wicked world. She gave him a little nod, then turned and went into the lodge. Poirot stood still, staring at the shut door. Chapter 5. In a mood of exploration, Poirot went through the front gates and down the steeply twisting road that presently emerged on a small quay. A large bell with a chain had a notice upon it, "Ring for the ferry." There were various boats moored by the side of the quay. A very old man with rheumy eyes, who had been leaning against a bollard, came shuffling towards Poirot.
Do we want a ferry, sir?
Oh, I think you know. I have just come from Nasse House for a little walk.
Ah, 'tis up in Nasse, you are. Worked there as a boy, I did, and my son, and he were head gardener there. But I used to look after the boats. Old Squire Folly, he was fair amazed about boats. Sailed in all weathers he would. The Major now, his son, he didn't care for sailing. Horses, that's all he cared about. And a pretty pack it went on them. Or that and the bottle. Had a hard time with him, his wife did. You've seen him, maybe. He lives at the lodge now, she do.
Yes, I have just left her there now.
Her be her Folliot, too. Second cousin from over Tiverton way. Yeah, a great one for the garden, she is. All them there flowering shrubs she put in. Even when it was took over during the war, and the two young gentlemen was gone to war, she still looked after these shrubs and kept them from being overrun.
It was hard on her, both her sons being killed.
She's had a hard life, she have, what with this and that. Trouble with her husband, trouble with the young gentleman, too. Well, not Mr. Henry. Oh, he was as nice a young gentleman as you could wish. Took after his grandfather. Fond of sailing, went in the Navy as a matter of course. But, Mr. James, he caused her a lot of trouble. The debts and women it were, and then, too, he were real wild in his temper. Born one of these can't go straight. But the war suited him, you might say. Give him his chance. There's many who can't go straight in peace who dies bravely in war.
So now, said Poirot, there are no more Folliots at Nasse? The old man's flow of talk died abruptly.
Just as you say, sir.
Poirot looked curiously at the old man. Why, instead, you have Sir George Stubbs. What is thought locally of him?
Well, as understands, said the old man, he be powerful rich.
His tone sounded dry and almost amused.
And his wife?
Well, she's a fine lady from London, she is. No use for gardens, not her, no. They do say, too, as her to be wanting a beer.
He tapped his temple significantly.
Well, not as her isn't always very nice-spoken, friendly. Just over a year they've been there. Bought the place, had it all done up like new. How I remember it all through yesterday, them arrived in the evening, they did. Day after the worst gale as ever I remember. Trees down right and left, one down across the drive, and I had to get it sawn away in a hurry to get the drive clear for the car. And the big oak up along, that came down and brought a lot of others down with it. Made a rare mess, it did.
Yes, that where the Folly stands now?
The old man turned aside and spat disgustedly.
Folly 'tis called, and folly 'tis. Newfangled nonsense, never was no folly in the old Folliot's time. Her ladyship's idea, that Folly was. Put up not 3 weeks after they first come. I've no doubt she talked Sir George into it. Rare silly, it looks stuck up there among the trees like a heathen temple. Now, a nice summer house, made rustic, like with stained glass. I'd have nothing against that.
Poirot smiled faintly.
Well, the London ladies, he said, they must have their fancies. It is sad that the day of the Folliots is over.
Do we never believe that, sir?
The old man gave a wheezy chuckle.
Always be Folliots at Nasse.
Oh, but the house belongs to Sir George Stubbs.
Ah, that's as may be, but there's still a Folliot here. Rare and cunning the Folliots are.
What do you mean? The old man gave him a sly, sideways glance.
Well, Mrs. Folliot been living at the lodge, been she?
He demanded. Yes, said Poirot slowly. Mrs. Folliot is living at the lodge, and the world is very wicked, and all the people in it are very wicked, eh? The old man stared at him. He said,
You've got something there, maybe?
He shuffled away again. Yeah, but what have I got? Poirot asked himself with irritation as he slowly walked up the hill and back to the house. Hercule Poirot made a meticulous toilette, applying a scented pomade to his moustaches and twirling them to a ferocious couple of points. He stood back from the mirror and was satisfied with what he saw. The sound of a gong resounded through the house, and he descended the stairs. The butler, having finished a most artistic performance, crescendo, forte, diminuendo, rallentando, was just replacing the gong stick on its hook. His dark, melancholy face showed pleasure. Poirot thought to himself, a blackmailing letter from the housekeeper? Or maybe the butler? This butler looked as though blackmailing letters would be well within his scope. Poirot wondered if Mrs. Oliver took her characters from life. Miss Brewis crossed the hall in an unbecoming flowered chiffon dress, and he caught up with her, asking as he did so, You have a housekeeper here? Oh, no, Monsieur Poirot. I'm afraid one doesn't run to niceties of that kind nowadays, except in a really large establishment, of course. No, I'm the housekeeper. Well, more housekeeper than secretary sometimes, in this house. She gave a short, acid laugh. Ah, so you are the housekeeper? Poirot considered her thoughtfully. He could not see Miss Brewis writing a blackmailing letter. Now, an anonymous letter, well, that would be a different thing. He had known anonymous letters written by women not unlike Miss Brewis, solid, dependable women, totally unsuspected by those around them. What is your butler's name? He asked. Hendon. Miss Brewis looked a little astonished. Poirot recollected himself and explained quickly. No, I asked because I had a fancy I had seen him somewhere before. Very likely, said Miss Brewis. None of these people ever seem to stay in any place more than 4 months. They must soon have done the round of all the available situations in England. After all, it's not many people who can afford butlers and cooks nowadays. They came into the drawing-room where Sir George, looking somehow rather unnatural in a dinner jacket, was proffering sherry. Mrs. Oliver, in iron-grey satin, was looking like an obsolete battleship, and Lady Stubbs's smooth black head was bent down as she studied the fashions in vogue. Alec and Sally Legg were dining, and also Jim Warburton.
We've a heavy evening ahead of us, he warned them. No bridge tonight. All hands to the pumps. There are any amount of notices to print and a big card for the fortune-telling. What name shall we have? Madame Zuleika? Esmeralda? Or Romany Lear, the Gypsy Queen?
The Eastern touch, said Sally. Everyone in agricultural districts hates gypsies. Zuleika sounds all right. I brought my paint-box over, and I thought Michael could do us a curling snake to ornament the notice.
But Cleopatra rather than Zuleika, then?
Hendon appeared at the door. Dinner is served, my lady. They went in. There were candles on the long table. The room was full of shadows. Warburton and Alec Legg sat on either side of their hostess. Poirot was between Mrs. Oliver and Miss Brewis. The latter was engaged in brisk general conversation about further details of preparation for tomorrow. Mrs. Oliver sat in brooding abstraction and hardly spoke. When she did at last break her silence, it was with a somewhat contradictory explanation. "Don't bother about me," she said to Poirot. "I am just remembering if there's anything I've forgotten." Sir George laughed heartily. "The fatal flaw, eh?" he remarked. "Yes, that's just it," said Mrs. Oliver. "There always is one. Sometimes one doesn't realize it until a book's actually in print, and then it's agony." Her face reflected this emotion. She sighed. "The curious thing is that most people never notice it." I say to myself, but of course the cook would have been bound to notice that 2 cutlets hadn't been eaten. But nobody else thinks of it at all. You fascinate me. Michael Wayman leant across the table. The mystery of the 2nd cutlet. Oh, please, please, never explain. I shall wonder about it in my bath. Mrs. Oliver gave him an abstracted smile and relapsed into her preoccupations. Lady Stubbs was also silent. Now and again she yawned. Warburton, Alec Legg, and Miss Brewis talked across her. As they came out of the dining-room, Lady Stubbs stopped by the stairs. "I'm going to bed," she announced. "I'm very sleepy." "Oh, Lady Stubbs," exclaimed Miss Brewis, "there's so much to be done. We've been counting on you to help us." "Yes, I know," said Lady Stubbs, "but I'm going to bed." She spoke with the satisfaction of a small child. She turned her head as Sir George came out of the dining-room. "I'm tired, George. I'm going to bed. You don't mind?" He came up to her and patted her on the shoulder affectionately.
"You go and get your beauty sleep, Hattie. Be fresh for tomorrow."
He kissed her lightly, and she went up the stairs, waving her hand and calling out, "Good night, all." Sir George smiled up at her. Miss Brewis drew in her breath sharply and turned brusquely away. "Come along, everybody," she said with a forced cheerfulness that did not ring true. "We've got to work." Presently, everyone was set to their tasks. Since Miss Brewis could not be everywhere at once, there were soon some defaulters. Michael Wayman ornamented a placard with a ferociously magnificent serpent and the words, "Madame Zuleika will tell your fortune," and then vanished unobtrusively. Alec Legg did a few nondescript chores and then went out, avowedly to measure for the hoopla, and did not reappear. The women, as women do, worked energetically and conscientiously. Hercule Poirot followed his hostess's example and went early to bed. Poirot came down to breakfast on the following morning at 9:30. Breakfast was served in pre-war fashion. A row of hot dishes on an electric heater. Sir George was eating a full-sized Englishman's breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon and kidneys. Mrs. Oliver and Miss Brewis had a modified version of the same. Michael Wayman was eating a plateful of cold ham. Only Lady Stubbs was unheedful of the flesh-pots and was nibbling thin toast and sipping black coffee. She was wearing a large pale pink hat which looked odd at the breakfast table. The post had just arrived. Miss Brewis had an enormous pile of letters in front of her, which she was rapidly sorting into piles. Any of Sir George's marked personal she passed over to him. The others she opened herself and sorted into categories. Lady Stubbs had 3 letters. She opened what were clearly a couple of bills and tossed them aside. Then she opened the 3rd letter and said suddenly and clearly, "Oh!" The exclamation was so startled that all heads turned towards her. "It's from Etienne," she said. "My cousin Etienne. He's coming here in a yacht."
"Well, let's see, Hattie."
Sir George held out his hand. She passed the letter down the table. He smoothed out the sheet and read.
"Now, who's this Etienne de Souza? A cousin, you say?"
"I think so. A 2nd cousin. I do not remember him very well. Hardly at all. He was—"
"Yes, my dear."
She shrugged her shoulders. "Oh, it does not matter. It is all a long time ago. I was a little girl."
"I suppose you wouldn't remember him very well. But we must make him welcome, of course," said Sir George heartily. "Pity in a way is the fête today. But we'll ask him to dinner. Perhaps we could put him up for a night or 2, or show him something of the country."
Sir George was being the hearty country squire. Lady Stubbs said nothing. She stared down into her coffee cup. Conversation on the inevitable subject of the fête became general. Only Poirot remained detached, watching the slim, exotic figure at the head of the table. He wondered just what was going on in her mind. At that very moment her eyes came up and cast a swift glance along the table to where he sat. It was a look so shrewd and appraising that he was startled. As their eyes met, the shrewd expression vanished. Emptiness returned. But that other look had been there, cold, calculating, watchful. Or had he imagined it? In any case, wasn't it true that people who were slightly mentally deficient very often had a kind of sly native cunning that sometimes surprised even the people who knew them best? He thought to himself that Lady Stubbs was certainly an enigma. People seemed to hold diametrically opposite ideas concerning her. Miss Brewis had intimated that Lady Stubbs knew very well what she was doing, yet Mrs. Oliver definitely thought her half-witted, and Mrs. Folliot, who had known her long and intimately, had spoken of her as someone not quite normal, who needed care and watchfulness. Miss Brewis was probably prejudiced. She disliked Lady Stubbs for her indolence and her aloofness. Poirot wondered if Miss Brewis had been Sir George's secretary prior to his marriage. If so, she might easily resent the coming of the new regime. Poirot himself would have agreed wholeheartedly with Mrs. Folliot and Mrs. Oliver until this morning. And after all, could he really rely on what had been only a fleeting impression? Lady Stubbs got up abruptly from the table. "I have a headache," she said. "I shall go and lie down in my room." Sir George sprang up anxiously. "Oh, my dear girl, you're all right, aren't you?" "Oh, no, it's just a headache." "Well, you'll be fit enough for this afternoon, won't you?" "Yes, I think so." "Take some aspirin, Lady Stubbs," said Miss Brewis briskly. "Have you got some, or shall I bring it to you?" "I've got some." She moved towards the door. As she went, she dropped the handkerchief she had been squeezing between her fingers. Poirot, moving quietly forward, picked it up unobtrusively. Sir George, about to follow his wife, was stopped by Miss Brewis. "About the parking of cars this afternoon, Sir George. I'm just going to give Mitchell instructions. Do you think that the best plan would be, as you said—" Poirot, going out of the room, heard no more. He caught up his hostess on the stairs. "Madame, you dropped this." He proffered the handkerchief with a bow. She took it unheedingly. "Did I? Thank you." "I am most distressed, madame, that you should be suffering, particularly when your cousin is coming." She answered quickly, almost violently. "I don't want to see Etienne. I don't like him. He's bad. He's always bad. I'm afraid of him. He does bad things." The door of the dining-room opened, and Sir George came across the hall and up the stairs. "Oh, Hattie, my poor darling, let me come and tuck you up." They went up the stairs together, his arms round her tenderly, his face worried and absorbed. Poirot looked up after them, then turned to encounter Miss Brewis, moving fast and clasping papers. "Lady Stubbs' headache," he began. "Oh, no more headache than my foot," said Miss Brewis crossly, and disappeared into her office, closing the door behind her. Poirot sighed and went out through the front door onto the terrace. Mrs. Masterton had just driven up in a small car and was directing the elevation of a tea marquee, baying out orders in rich, full-blooded tones. She turned to greet Poirot. "Oh, such a nuisance, these affairs," she observed, "and they will always put everything in the wrong place. No, Rogers, more to the left. Left, not right. What do you think of the weather, Monsieur Poirot? It looks doubtful to me. Rain, of course, would spoil everything, and we've had such a fine summer this year for a change. Where's Sir George? I want to talk to him about car parking."
His wife had a headache and has gone to lie down."
Well, she'll be all right this afternoon," said Mrs. Masterton confidently. "Likes functions, you know. She'll make a terrific toilette, and she'll be as pleased about it as a child. You'll just fetch me a bundle of those pegs over there, will you? I want to mark the places for the clock golf numbers." Poirot, thus pressed into service, was worked by Mrs. Masterton relentlessly as a useful apprentice. She condescended to talk to him in the intervals of hard labour. "Got to do everything yourself, I find. Only way. By the way, you're a friend of the Elliots, I believe." Poirot, after his long sojourn in England, comprehended that this was an indication of social recognition. Mrs. Masterton was in fact saying, "Although a foreigner, I understand you're one of us." She continued to chat in an intimate manner. "It's nice to have Nasse lived in again. We were all so afraid it was going to be a hotel.
You know what it is nowadays. One drives through the country and passes place after place with a board-up guest house or private hotel or hotel AA, fully licensed. All the houses one stayed in as a girl, or where one went to dances. Those are very sad. Yes, I'm glad about Nasse, and so is poor dear Amy Folliot, of course. She's had such a hard life, but never complains, I will say. Sir George has done wonders for Nasse, and not vulgarised it. I don't know whether that's the result of Amy Folliot's influence, or whether it's his own natural good taste. He has got quite good taste, you know. Very surprising in a man like that.
But he is not, I understand, one of the landed gentry, said Poirot cautiously.
Well, he isn't even really Sir George. Was christened it, I understand. Took the idea from Lord George Sanger's circus, I suspect. Very amusing, really. Of course, we never let on. Rich men must be allowed their little snobberies, don't you agree? But the funny thing is that in spite of his origins, George Stubbs would go down perfectly well anywhere. He's a throwback, pure type of the 18th century country squire. Good blood in him, I'd say. Father a gent and mother a barmaid, is my guess.
Mrs. Masterton interrupted herself to yell to a gardener.
Not by that rhododendron! You must leave room for the skittles over to the right! Right! Not left!
She went on.
Extraordinary! How they can't tell their left from their right! Well, the Bruce woman is efficient. Doesn't like poor Hattie, though. Looks at her sometimes as though she'd like to murder her. So many of these good secretaries are in love with their boss. Now, where do you think Jim Warburton could have got to? Silly the way he sticks to calling himself captain, not a regular soldier, and never within miles of a German. One has to put up, of course, with what one can get these days, and he's a hard worker, but I feel there's something rather fishy about him. Here are the legs!
Sally Legg, dressed in slacks and a yellow pullover, said brightly, "We've come to help."
"Well, lots to do,"
boomed Mrs. Masterton.
"Now, let me see."
Poirot, profiting by her inattention, slipped away. As he came round the corner of the house onto the front terrace, he became a spectator of a new drama. Two young women, in shorts with bright blouses, had come out from the wood and were standing uncertainly, looking up at the house. In one of them, he thought he recognised the Italian girl of yesterday's lift in the car. From the window of Lady Stubbs' bedroom, Sir George leaned out and addressed them wrathfully.
"You're trespassing!"
he shouted.
"Please?"
said the young woman with the green headscarf.
"You can't come through here! Private!"
The other young woman, who had a royal blue headscarf, said brightly,
"Please, Nasse 𝐃𝐚𝐝."
She pronounced it carefully.
"It is this way, please."
"You're trespassing!"
bellowed Sir George.
"Please."
"Trespassing! No way through! You've got to go back! Back! The way you came!"
They stared as he gesticulated. Then they consulted together in a flood of foreign speech, and finally, doubtfully, Bluescarf said,
"Back? To hostel?"
"That's right! And you take the road round that way."
They retreated unwillingly. Sir George mopped his brow and looked down at Poirot.
"Spend my time turning people off," he said. "Used to come through the top gate when I've padlocked that. Now they come through the woods, having got over the fence. Think they can get down to the shore and the quay easily this way. Well, they can, of course, much quicker, but there's no right-of-way, never has been. And they're practically all foreigners. Don't understand what you say and just jabber back at you in Dutch or something."
"Of these, one is German and the other Italian, I think. I saw the Italian girl on her way from the station yesterday."
Well, every kind of language they talk. Yes, Hattie? What did you say?"
He drew back into the room. Poirot turned to find Mrs. Oliver and a well-developed girl of 14 dressed in guide uniform close behind him. "This is Marlene," said Mrs. Oliver. Marlene giggled.
"I'm the horrible corpse," she said. "But I'm not going to have any blood on me."
Her tone expressed disappointment.
"No? No.
Just strangled with a cord, that's all. I'd have liked to be stabbed and have lashings of red paint."
"Captain Warburton thought it might look too realistic," said Mrs. Oliver.
But in a murder I think you ought to have blood,"
said Marlene sulkily. She looked at Poirot with hungry interest.
"Seen lots of murders, haven't you? Well, so she says."
"Oh, 1 or 2,
said Poirot modestly. He observed with alarm that Mrs. Oliver was leaving them.
"Any sex maniacs?"
asked Marlene with avidity.
Certainly not."
"Well, I like sex maniacs,"
said Marlene with relish.
"Well, reading about them, I mean."
"You would probably not like meeting one."
"Oh, I don't know. Do you know what? I believe we've got a sex maniac round here. My granddad saw a body in the woods once. He was scared and ran away, and when he come back it was gone. It was a woman's body. But of course he's batty. My granddad is, so no one listens to what he says."
Poirot managed to escape, and, regaining the house by a circuitous route, took refuge in his bedroom. He felt in need of repose. Chapter 6. Lunch was an early and quickly snatched affair of a cold buffet. At 2:30, a minor film star was to open the fête. The weather, after looking ominously like rain, began to improve. By 3 o'clock the fête was in full swing. People were paying the admission charge of £0.50 in large numbers, and cars were lining one side of the long drive. Students from the youth hostel arrived in batches, conversing loudly in foreign tongues. True to Mrs. Masterton's forecast, Lady Stubbs had emerged from her bedroom just before 2:30, dressed in a cyclamen dress with an enormous coolie-shaped hat of black straw. She wore large quantities of diamonds. Miss Brewis murmured sardonically, "Thinks it's the royal enclosure at Ascot, evidently." But Poirot complimented her gravely.
"It is a beautiful creation that you have on, madame."
"It is nice, isn't it?"
said Hattie happily.
"I wore it for Ascot."
The minor film star was arriving, and Hattie moved forward to greet her. Poirot retreated into the background. He wandered around disconsolately. Everything seemed to be proceeding in the normal fashion of fêtes. There was a coconut shy, presided over by Sir George in his heartiest fashion, a skittle alley, and a hoopla. There were various stalls displaying local produce of fruit, vegetables, jams, and cakes, and others displaying fancy objects. There were raffles of cakes, of baskets of fruit, even, it seemed, of a pig, and a lucky dip for children at 2 a go. There was a good crowd of people by now, and an exhibition of children's dancing began. Poirot saw no sign of Mrs. Oliver, but Lady Stubbs's cyclamen pink figure showed up amongst the crowd as she drifted rather vaguely about. The focus of attention, however, seemed to be Mrs. Folliot. She was quite transformed in appearance, wearing a hydrangea blue foulard frock and a smart grey hat. She appeared to preside over the proceedings, greeting new arrivals and directing people to the various sideshows. Poirot lingered near her and listened to some of the conversations.
"Amy, my dear, how are you?"
"Oh, Pamela, how nice of you and Edward to come. Such a long way from Tiverton."
"Oh, the weather's held for you. Remember the year before the war? Cloudburst came down about 4 o'clock, ruined the whole show." "Oh, yes, but it's been a wonderful summer this year." "Dorothy, it's ages since I've seen you." "Well, we felt we had to come and see Nasse in its glory. I see you've cut back the berberis on the bank." "Yes, it shows the hydrangeas better, don't you think? How wonderful they are. What a blue. But, my dear, you've done wonders in the last year. Nasse is really beginning to look itself again."
Dorothy's husband boomed in a deep voice.
"Came over to see the commandant here during the war. Nearly broke my heart."
Mrs. Folliot turned to greet a humbler visitor.
"Oh, Mrs. Napper, I am pleased to see you. Is this Lucy? Oh, how she's grown." "Well, she'll be leaving school next year. Pleased to see you looking so well, ma'am." "Well, I'm very well, thank you. Now, you must go and try your luck at hoopla, Lucy. See you in the tea tent later, Mrs. Napper. I shall be helping with the teas."
An elderly man, presumably Mr. Napper, said diffidently,
Pleased to have you back at Nasse, ma'am. Seems like old times.
Mrs. Folliot's response was drowned as 2 women and a big, beefy man rushed towards her.
Amy, dear! Such ages! Oh, this looks the greatest success. Do tell me what you've done about the rose garden. Muriel told me that you're restocking it with all the new floribundas.
The beefy man chipped in.
Oh, where's Marilyn Gale?
Oh, Reggie's just dying to meet her. He saw her last picture.
Is that her in the big hat? My word, that's some get-up.
Don't be stupid, darling. That's Hattie Stubbs. You know, Amy, you really shouldn't let her go around quite so like a mannequin.
Amy?
Another friend claimed attention.
This is Roger, Edward's boy. Oh, my dear, so nice to have you back at Nasse.
Poirot moved slowly away and absent-mindedly invested a shilling on a ticket that might win him the pig. He heard faintly still the
"Oh, so good of you to come"
refrain from behind him. He wondered whether Mrs. Folliot realized how completely she had slipped into the role of hostess, or whether it was entirely unconscious. She was, very definitely this afternoon, Mrs. Folliot of Nasse House. He was standing by the tent, labelled Madame Zuleika will tell your fortune for 2 and 6. Teas had just begun to be served, and there was no longer a queue for the fortune-telling. Poirot bowed his head, entered the tent, and paid over his half-crown willingly for the privilege of sinking into a chair and resting his aching feet. Madame Zuleika was wearing flowing black robes, a gold tinsel scarf wound round her head, and a veil across the lower half of her face, which slightly muffled her remarks. A gold bracelet hung with lucky charms, tinkled, as she took Poirot's hand and gave him a rapid reading, agreeably full of money to come, success with a dark beauty, and a miraculous escape from an accident.
"Oh, it is all very agreeable that you tell me, Madame Legge. I only wish it could come true."
"Oh," said Sally. "So you know it's me, do you?"
"I had advance information. Mrs. Oliver told me that you were originally to be the victim, but that you had been snatched from her for the occult."
"Oh, well, I wish I was being the body," said Sally. "Much more peaceful. All Jim Warburton's fault. Is it 4 o'clock yet? Oh, I want my tea. I'm off duty from 4 to past.
10 minutes to go still," said Poirot, consulting his large, old-fashioned watch. "Now, shall I bring you a cup of tea here?"
"Oh, no, I want the break. This tent is stifling. Are there a lot of people waiting still?"
"Oh, no, I think they are lining up for tea."
"Good." Poirot emerged from the tent and was immediately challenged by a determined woman and made to pay 6pence and guess the weight of a cake. A hoopla stall, presided over by a fat, motherly woman, urged him to try his luck, and, much to his discomfiture, he immediately won a large Cupid doll. Walking sheepishly along with this, he encountered Michael Wayman, who was standing gloomily on the outskirts near the top of a path that led down to the quay. "You seem to have been enjoying yourself, Monsieur Poirot," he said with a sardonic grin. Poirot contemplated his prize.
"It is truly horrible, is it not?"
he said sadly. A small child near him suddenly burst out crying. Poirot stooped swiftly and tucked the doll into the child's arm.
"Voilà, it is for you."
The tears ceased abruptly.
"There, Violet. Isn't the gentleman kind? Say tar, ever so."
"Children's fancy dress,"
called out Captain Warburton through a megaphone.
"The first class, 3 to 5. Form up, please."
Poirot moved towards the house and was cannoned into by a young man who was stepping backwards to take a better aim at a coconut. The young man scowled, and Poirot apologized mechanically, his eye held fascinated by the varied pattern of the young man's shirt. He recognized it as the turtle shirt of Sir George's description. Every kind of turtle, tortoise, and sea monster appeared to be writhing and crawling over it. Poirot blinked and was accosted by the Dutch girl to whom he had given a lift the day before.
"So you have come to the fête," he said. "And your friend?"
"Oh, yes, she too comes here this afternoon. I have not seen her yet, but we shall leave together by the bus that goes from the gates at 5:15. We go to Torquay. and there I changed to another bus for Plymouth. It is convenient." This explained what had puzzled Poirot, the fact that the Dutch girl was perspiring under the weight of a rucksack. He said, "I saw your friend this morning." "Oh, yes, Elsa, a German girl, was with her, and she told me they had tried to get through woods to the river and quay, and the gentleman who owns the house was very angry and made them go back." She added, turning her head to where Sir George was urging competitors on at the coconut shy, "But now, this afternoon, he is very polite." Poirot considered explaining that there was a difference between young women who were trespassers and the same young women when they had paid 2 shillings and 6pence entrance fee and were legally entitled to sample the delights at Nasse House and its grounds. But Captain Warburton and his megaphone bore down upon him. The captain was looking hot and bothered.
"Have you seen Lady Stubbs, Poirot? Well, anyone seen Lady Stubbs? She's supposed to be judging this fancy dress business. I can't find her anywhere."
I saw her, let me see, about half an hour ago, but then I went to have my fortune told."
"Oh, curse the woman," said Warburton angrily. "Where can she have disappeared to? The children are waiting, and we're behind the schedule as it is."
He looked round.
"Where's Amanda Brewis?"
Miss Brewis also was not in evidence.
"It really is too bad," said Warburton. "One's got to have some cooperation if one's trying to run a show. Where can Hattie be? Well, perhaps she's gone into the house."
He strode off rapidly. Poirot edged his way towards the roped-off space where teas were being served in a large marquee, but there was a long queue waiting, and he decided against it. He inspected the fancy goods stall, where a determined old lady very nearly managed to sell him a plastic collar box, and finally made his way round the outskirts to a place where he could contemplate the activity from a safe distance. He wondered where Mrs. Oliver was. Footsteps behind him made him turn his head. A young man was coming up the path from the quay, a very dark young man, faultlessly attired in yachting costume. He paused as though disconcerted by the scene before him. Then he spoke hesitatingly to Poirot. "You will excuse me. Is this the house of Sir George Stubbs?"
"It is indeed."
Poirot paused and then hazarded a guess.
"Are you perhaps the cousin of Lady Stubbs?"
"I am Etienne de Souza."
"Oh, my name is Hercule Poirot."
They bowed to each other. Poirot explained the circumstances of the fête. As he finished, Sir George came across the lawn towards them from the coconut shy.
"De Souza? Oh, delighted to see you. Hattie got your letter this morning. Where's your yacht?"
"Oh, it is moored at Hellmouth. I came up the river to the quay here in my launch."
Well, we must find Hattie. She's somewhere about. Look, you'll dine with us this evening, I hope."
"Oh, you are most kind."
"Well, can we put you up?"
"Well, that is also most kind, but I will sleep on my yacht. It is easier so."
"Oh, now, are you staying here long?"
2 or 3 days, perhaps. It depends."
De Souza shrugged elegant shoulders.
"Well, Hattie will be delighted, I'm sure," said Sir George politely. "Where is she? I saw her not long ago."
He looked around in a perplexed manner.
"Well, now, she ought to be judging the children's fancy dress, but I can't understand it. Look, excuse me a moment. I'll ask Miss Brewis."
He hurried off. De Souza looked after him. Poirot looked at de Souza.
"It is some little time since you last saw your cousin, eh?"
he asked. The other shrugged his shoulders. "I have not seen her since she was 15 years old. Soon after that she was sent abroad, to school, at a convent in France. As a child, she promised to have good looks." He looked inquiringly at Poirot.
"Oh, well, she is a beautiful woman,"
said Poirot. "And that is her husband? He seems what they call a good fellow, but not perhaps very polished. Still, for Hattie it might be perhaps a little difficult to find a suitable husband." Poirot remained with a politely inquiring expression on his face. The other laughed. "Oh, no, it's no secret. At 15, Hattie was mentally undeveloped. Feeble-minded, do you not call it? She is still the same?"
It would seem so, yes,"
said Poirot cautiously. D'Souza shrugged his shoulders. "Ah, well, why should one ask it of women? That they should be intelligent? It is not necessary." Sir George was back, fuming. Miss Brewis was with him, speaking rather breathlessly. "Well, I've no idea where she is, Sir George. I saw her over by the fortune-teller's tent last, but that was at least 20 minutes, or half an hour ago. She's not in the house." "Is it not possible," asked Poirot, "that she has gone to observe the progress of Mrs. Oliver's murder hunt?" Sir George's brow cleared. "Oh, that's probably it. Look here, I can't leave the shows here. I'm in charge, and Amanda's got her hands full. Could you possibly have a look around, Poirot? You know the course." But Poirot did not know the course. However, an inquiry of Miss Brewis gave him rough guidance. Miss Brewis took brisk charge of D'Souza, and Poirot went off murmuring to himself like an incantation.
Tennis court, Camellia Garden, the Folly, upper nursery garden, the boathouse.
As he passed the coconut shy, he was amused to notice Sir George proffering wooden balls with a dazzling smile of welcome to the same young Italian woman whom he had driven off that morning, and who was clearly puzzled at his change of attitude. He went on his way to the tennis court, but there was no one there but an old gentleman of military aspect who was fast asleep on a garden seat with his hat pulled over his eyes. Poirot retraced his steps to the house and went on down to the Camellia Garden.
End of Disc 2.
If you enjoyed this audio and the value and effort that we bring you these audios of world-class authors, then why not buy us a cup of coffee? Look for the link below in the description area. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you will not miss another audio. Thank you for supporting this channel. It is appreciated.